because of the size of the crowd. I'm sorry about that. Also, as you noticed, MFA is selling Mr. Rothstein's books on site. There will be a book signing outside the theater after the program. Before we get started, I want to thank the people who make this possible. The KI Forum is made possible thanks in large part to our friends at Centerpoint Energy, the lead sponsor of the lecture series. Tracy Yonda is up there from Centerpoint. Thank you very much for being here tonight. This series is also made possible through a generous multi-year grant from Houston Endowment. And in addition, the Institute itself also relies on philanthropic investments from many contributors. Special thanks go to Nancy Kinder and the Kinder Foundation, our endowing donors, Laura and Tom Bacon, Chevron, Raynet and Stan Merrick, BP America, HEB, Catherine and Hank Coleman, Sarah Doug Fauché, Sis and Hasty Johnson, Becky and Ralph O'Connor. We were saddened to learn of Ralph's passing recently. Bank of America, Heinz, Silver Eagle Distributors, and United Way of Greater Houston. Thank you to all of our sponsors for everything that you do for us. We're running out of room, but there's still a few seats in the front row and a couple seats over on the left-hand side, and there's a couple more. So now let's introduce our speaker. We are really thrilled tonight to have Richard Rothstein speak to us tonight. Richard is a distinguished fellow at the Economic Policy Institute. He is a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and previously he was the national education columnist for the New York Times. His research focuses on the history of education and housing segregation in the United States. And his most recent book, the one that you all probably know about and the one that's being sold outside, is The Color of Law, or Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, which explores government policies that he contends are the causes of today's residential segregation. It's a truly extraordinary book. So with that, I will introduce Richard Rothstein. Thank you so much for coming here tonight.
Thank you very much, Bill, and thanks to all of you for coming here to engage with me in this conversation this evening. I still see a couple of seats if a couple of people want to come down. There's one here, a couple over there. Don't worry, if you sit in the front, the teacher's not going to call on you. Let me begin by reminding you that something you all know, and that is in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. The civil rights movement began with lawyers challenging segregation in law schools because they figured that if judges couldn't understand anything else, they might be able to figure out that you couldn't get a good legal education in a segregated law school. And then they used that precedent to challenge segregation in colleges and universities, and were successful. And then that became a precedent for Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, a decision with which you're all familiar with, that banned legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And then Brown gave impetus to a burgeoning civil rights movement that engaged in marches and demonstrations, civil disobedience. People lost their lives. And it attacked successfully segregation in water fountains and buses, lunch counters, interstate transportation, public accommodations of all kinds. And then at the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement folded up its tent and left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. There are clearly defined areas in every one that I've lived in. They're either all or mostly white, or all or mostly African American. How could it be? The civil rights movement decided, knew, and the country agreed, for the most part, that segregation was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful to both African Americans and to whites, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. How could it be that we left untouched the biggest segregation of all, having understood all of that? And it's a puzzle, a big puzzle, but I think in one sense we can understand it a bit. Racial segregation in neighborhoods is a lot harder to undo than all the other racial segregations that we attacked. If we end segregation in water fountains, the next day you drink from any water fountain. But if you end segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things would look much different. And so what we've done, all of us, and I include myself, I include all of you, liberals, conservatives, African Americans and whites, Northerners and Southerners, Republicans and Democrats, we've adopted a national myth, a rationalization that excuses ourselves from addressing the last remaining and the biggest form of segregation. And that national myth goes something like this. We tell ourselves that, oh, all those other forms of segregation that we abolished, whether it was law schools or colleges or elementary and secondary schools or lunch counters, all of those were mandated by law or ordinance or policy, government policy of one kind. As such, they violate the Constitution. If the federal government was mandating segregation, it would violate the Fifth Amendment. If state and local governments were violating it, it would violate the 14th Amendment. They were civil rights violations. And if we find a civil rights violation, the Constitution requires us to remedy it. We need to do something about it. Residential segregation, on the other hand, we tell ourselves is completely different. Residential segregation, we say, that didn't happen because of law, because of ordinance, because of policy. That happened sort of accidentally. It happened because private homeowners in white neighborhoods refused to sell homes to African Americans, or maybe actors in the private economy, whether real estate agents or banks, discriminated in how they showed homes or issued mortgages, guaranteed mortgages. Or maybe it's because people just like to live with each other of the same race. Everybody wants to live in the same race community. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's mostly because of income differences. African Americans on average, not always, but on average have lower incomes than whites, and so it's harder for them to live in middle-class white communities. All of these individual, personal, bigoted maybe, but private decisions is what's created residential segregation. It wasn't government law, regulation, or policy. And what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. We don't think residential segregation is a good thing. Most of us don't, at least. But we don't feel any responsibility to do something about it the way we felt a responsibility to do something about all those other forms of segregation 50, 60, 70 years ago. We give a name to this national myth. It's a term we all use. I used it. You use it, I'm sure. We say that what we have when it comes to neighborhoods is de facto segregation. Just in fact, not in law. And where you have de facto segregation, it's not a civil rights violation, it's an unfortunate occurrence, and we're not obligated to do anything about it. Well, I spent many years studying and writing about education policy. And I spent a lot of time denouncing a policy that I was the national education columnist in the New York Times for a while. I denounced a policy that started here in Texas. The policy that said that the only reason we have an achievement gap between African American and white children in our schools today is because teachers have low expectations of black children. And only if we tested children more and held teachers accountable for those test scores, the achievement gap would disappear. And we actually embodied, as you all know, that in a law called the No Child Left Behind law. It was a bipartisan law. You can't only blame President Bush. It was co-sponsored by Ted Kennedy and George Miller, leading Democrats in Congress, and I regarded that law as utter nonsense. I didn't, to put it mildly. I spent a lot of time writing columns and articles explaining what the actual pathways were by which social and economic disadvantage, which are disparately occur in low-income African-American communities, is the cause of the achievement gap, not teacher low expectations. And for example, give you one example. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it because that would be another lecture. You're not going to be here for 3 hours. So. But for example, I wrote a column I remember about asthma. African-American children in low-income neighborhoods in this country have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children in suburban neighborhoods. And if a child has asthma, that child is likely to be up at night, wheezing, maybe come to school drowsy the next day, maybe come to school sleepless, maybe absent. Asthma is the largest chronic cause of school absenteeism. And I tried to explain that if you had 2 groups of children who are equal in every respect, 2 identical groups of children, one of the same racial composition, same socioeconomic background, same family structure, identical in every way you can imagine, except that one group had a higher rate of asthma than the other. That group was inevitably going to have lower average achievement because children becoming to school drowsy. It's not to say that every child with asthma has lower achievement than typical children without, because as you all know, there's a distribution of outcomes for every human characteristic. But if you have a group of children who is similar to the other group, but one group is coming to school drowsier, that group is going to have lower average achievement. And I went through condition after condition that children from disadvantaged communities have, whether it's asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or stress from parental insecurity. You can go on and on with all of these conditions. And when you add them up, they explain the achievement gap pretty much. And no matter how high teacher expectations are, high expectations is not going to wake up a child who comes to school drowsy. So that was the work I was doing, and I'm a slow learner. Gradually dawned on me that if you have, a child in school with asthma, that's one thing. But if you have a school where every child, where we've concentrated children who have either asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or stress, you concentrate them in single schools and single classrooms. The notion that those schools simply with higher teacher expectations are going to achieve at the same level as schools where children come to school well-rested and healthy and in stable homes is nonsense. So that was what I was thinking about, and the schools that where we concentrate children like that, of course, are called segregated schools. Schools today are more segregated than any time in the last 45 years because the neighborhoods in which they were located were segregated. So, as I say, that's what I was thinking about 10 years ago. And then in 2007, I guess that's 12 years ago now, isn't it? In 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision which prohibited 2 school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington, from embarking on a very, very token, trivial school desegregation plan to try to address, in a minimal way, the problems I was just describing. And in both districts, Seattle and Louisville, parents were given the choice of which school their child would attend within the district. But if the choice was going to exacerbate the segregation of that school, the racial homogeneity of that school, that choice wouldn't be honored in favor of choice of a child who wouldn't do that. So if you had, for example, a school that was either mostly white or all white, and there was one place left, and a black and a white child both applied for that last remaining place, the black child would be given some preference as a way to help desegregate the schools. A trivial, trivial program. How many times do you have one place left? Both black and white. You couldn't imagine a more trivial desegregation program, but the Supreme Court denounced it, said it was unconstitutional. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the controlling opinion. He said that, yes, the schools in Seattle are segregated, but they're segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. I thought that was a pretty wise observation on the Chief Justice's part. Indeed, that is why the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregaed. And then he went on to say that the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated de facto, for all the reasons I just described. Government wasn't responsible, and where you have de facto segregation, there's nothing you can do about it. Well, I remembered when I read this case, I suddenly was struck by remembering reading about a situation in Louisville, Kentucky, one of those 2 cities, some years before, where a white homeowner in an all-white suburb of single-family homes of Louisville, a suburb called Shively, had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville in a rented apartment. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, middle-class job, the wife and the daughter. He wanted to move to a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this all-white suburb of Shively bought a second home in this suburb and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry white mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police couldn't identify a single perpetrator, even though the police were there. The mob dynamited and firebombed the home, and the police still couldn't identify a single perpetrator. Except when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, jailed, and convicted and jailed for the 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, an agent of the state, the courts, the prosecutors, the entire criminal justice system was being used to enforce racial boundaries. And so I began to wonder if there was something about the history of Louisville that Chief Justice John Roberts didn't know. And that's how the research began that led to this book. I discovered in the course of looking into this further that, and I don't exaggerate when I use these numbers, I'm saying it deliberately, there were thousands of cases of police-protected violence against African-American families who tried to move, usually borderline areas, move into predominantly white neighborhoods surrounding black central cities, thousands of cases. Every one of them was a 14th Amendment violation. But it wasn't only police-protected violence that created the segregation that we know. It was also a range of federal, state, and local policies that were so interlocked and so mutually reinforcing and so powerful that they determine the racial boundaries that we still see today. So powerful, so interlocked, so mutually reinforcing that I concluded in this book that we don't have a de facto system of racial segregation. We have what the lawyers call a de jure system of racial segregation, residential segregation, which is just as unconstitutional, just as much a civil rights violation as the segregation of water fountains or lunch counters or buses. And as such, all of us, as American citizens, have an obligation to do something about it. We all have to enforce our Constitution. And if we have a civil rights violation, it has to be remedied. So understanding this history, understanding the myth of de facto segregation and how it actually happened is an essential precondition to undoing it, to addressing it, and to remedying it. Well, I'm going to describe this evening some other policies that the federal government in particular followed in order to enforce, maintain, perpetuate racial segregation. I only have time to describe a couple of policies. There are many, many others that I describe in the book, as I say, all interlocking and reinforcing. But let me begin with public housing. All of us think we know what public housing is. Public housing, we think, is a place where poor people live. Lots of single mothers with children, lots of young men without jobs in the formal economy, engaging in oppositional behavior, attracting the attention of the police, lots of deteriorated buildings, lots of dirt around them, not grass. That's our image of public housing. But that's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country during the New Deal, during the Roosevelt administration, during the Depression. It was not a program for poor people. Poor people were not permitted into public housing. It was for working families with stable employment records, with good jobs, who could afford to rent their own apartments, but for whom no apartments were available because during the Depression there was no construction being built, and so the housing supply fell short of the demand. And the Public Works Administration, the first New Deal agency, built the first public housing for working families in this country who would pay the full cost of the housing and their rent. It wasn't a subsidized program. It was addressing the housing shortage. But everywhere the Public Works Administration built this housing, it built it on a segregated basis. Frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. Now, maybe that will surprise some of you, but in the early 20th centuries, we had a lot more integration than we have today. We would be stunned if we were transported back to the early 20th century, even here in Houston, to see the extent of integration that existed at that time. It's not that every community was integrated. It's clearly not the case. There was a lot of informal segregation, but there was also a lot of integration for the simple reason that almost all jobs, we were a manufacturing economy at the time, and factories, warehouses, services that supported those factories and warehouses had to be located near a deep water port or a railroad terminal, because that's how they would get their parts and ship their final products. And if you had a factory district like that, which employed Irish immigrant workers and Italian immigrant workers and Jewish workers and African Americans, they all had to live in broadly the same neighborhoods so they could walk to work. They didn't have automobiles to commute. They had to be able to walk to work, in some cases take short streetcar rides. So you had a lot of integrated working class neighborhoods surrounding these industrial districts. The Public Works Administration went into many of them, demolished housing, integrated housing, to create separate projects for African Americans and for whites, creating patterns of segregation that hadn't previously existed. The great African American poet, novelist, playwright, Langston Hughes, I trust many of you are familiar with him, wrote in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated Cleveland neighborhood. We don't think of downtown Cleveland today as an integrated place, but he said his best friend in high school was Polish. He said he dated a Jewish girl. That was the kind of community he grew up in. But in that downtown neighborhood of Cleveland, called the Central Neighborhood of Cleveland, the Public Works Administration demolished housing to build two separate projects. One for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation in that community, and building other segregated projects elsewhere in the city that certainly made much more solid whatever incipient forms of segregation that formerly existed in Cleveland at that time, and it determined the racial landscape of Cleveland today. And this it did all over the country. In my book, as for some of you who've read it, you know that I like to focus to the extent I can on self-satisfied, smug places that think they're better than you are. Cambridge, Massachusetts, for example. The area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood, during the 1930s was an integrated neighborhood. It was about half black and half white. Public Works Administration demolished housing in the Central Square neighborhood to build two separate projects, one for blacks, one for whites, segregating people who hadn't previously been segregated. And with that and other projects elsewhere in the Boston metropolitan area created a pattern of segregation that still exists. During World War II, the plants were located in places that didn't have large populations frequently, that couldn't absorb the vast influx of war workers coming to work there. And if the government wanted the airplanes and the tanks and the jeeps and the ships to be produced, it had to somehow find housing for these migrants who were coming from Texas and Louisiana and the Midwest to work in these plants. And it did. It built housing everywhere in the country, creating segregated housing for workers who were working in the same war plants, working side by side in the same war plants, creating segregated patterns frequently in communities that hadn't previously known segregation, not even informal segregation. Another self-satisfied smug place, I happen to live there now, Berkeley, California. A small suburb of Berkeley, just north of Berkeley, Richmond, California, became the center of shipbuilding during World War II, war shipbuilding. It was a small community, about 20,000. There were a few African Americans living on the outskirts of Richmond, but it was a white community. 100,000 workers came there during the war. They brought families. 20,000, I know that Bill Fulton, the director of the Kinder Institute, was a city planner. Maybe he can explain to you how you grow a community from 20,000 to 300,000 in a period of 4 years. It would be a challenge to your profession. Well, it couldn't be done. The only way to do it is with the government building vast amounts of housing for war workers, and it did. It built housing for the African American workers, separate housing along the railroad tracks and in the industrial area. And it built housing for the white workers in the more residential areas where shopping was and other amenities were accessible. We can say with absolute certainty that these federal government actions during World War II is what created the segregation on the West Coast. There was no informal segregation to speak of, to build upon. Historians will tell you that there were two great migrations of African Americans out of the South, the former slave states, into the rest of the country in the 20th century. The first great migration took place during World War I. The second Great Migration took place during World War II. Very few African Americans participated in the first Great Migration, to the West Coast, that is. It was only the second Great Migration that brought African Americans to the West Coast, and because of these war industries. So the pattern of segregation that was created by the federal government for the war industries is what determined the future growth of segregation in all those communities, whether it's Portland or Seattle or the San Francisco Bay Area, like I was just describing, or Los Angeles. All of these became segregated for the first time by federal war worker housing. After World War II, there was still an enormous housing shortage in this country. Not only was no housing built during the Depression, except for these few public works projects that I talked about. During the war, it was actually illegal to use construction materials for civilian purposes unless you were building housing for war workers. And so very little housing was built for the rest of the population. And then you had millions of returning war veterans after World War II coming home demanding housing. We had an enormous housing crisis. People living in open fields and Quonset huts, doubled, tripled up with relatives. It was a crisis of homelessness and housing shortage, much like we have today in this country. And President Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt after World War II, had to respond to this housing crisis, and so he did. He proposed a vast expansion of public housing in the country. Again, we're not talking about housing for poor people. These were returning war veterans who needed the housing, people who had jobs in the post-war boom, black and white. The whites had better jobs than the blacks. That's a third lecture I can give you, but I'll refrain. But they all had jobs. They could afford housing, but there was no housing available. And so he proposed a vast expansion of the public housing program. And the story I'm going to tell you now about the 1949 Housing Act is probably the most important thing I'm going to describe to you this evening, and it's because it has such enormous resonance for the crisis that we face today. Conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat Truman's proposal in 1949 for 1948-49 for a expansion of the public housing program. Not because they didn't like poor people. It was not for poor people. It was for working families who would pay the full cost of housing and their rent. And not for racial reasons. It was always segregated. That's what public housing was. They understood that. They weren't unhappy with that. They wanted to defeat it because they thought that public housing was socialistic. And the government shouldn't be involved in housing. It should be done by the private sector, although the private sector wasn't addressing the needs of returning war veterans. So they came up with a plan, a strategy that we refer to as a poison pill strategy. A poison pill strategy is one where opponents of a bill in Congress propose an amendment to the bill, which they think can pass. They think can get a majority for this amendment. But the amendment is such that when the full bill comes up before Congress, as amended, it becomes unpalatable to a different majority and the entire bill goes down to defeat. So the amendment is called a poison pill. And conservatives in Congress came up with the following amendment. They said that from now on, you can't have racial discrimination in public housing anymore. No more segregation in public housing. It has to be an integrated program, non-discriminatory. Of course, it was a cynical amendment. They didn't want public housing at all, but they planned to vote for this integration amendment. They thought they would be joined by enough northern liberal Democrats to pass the integration amendment. But then when the full bill came up on the floor of Congress, as a program that would require non-discrimination, the conservatives would flip and vote against the bill. They would be joined by Southern Democrats, who would join them in voting against the bill, and that would create a new majority, and the bill would go down to defeat. So that was their strategy, their poison pill strategy. What were Northern liberals going to do? I would say it's not an easy decision. They faced an enormous housing crisis like we have today. Were they going to support the integration amendment, as many of them wanted to do, and ensure that there would be no public housing built because the entire bill would go down to defeat if the amendment was, or were they going to oppose the integration amendment and see continued public housing on a segregated basis? Well, it's a difficult decision. I'm not minimizing the difficulty of the decision. The leading liberal in the Senate at that time was a senator from Illinois, Senator Paul Douglas. He was joined in leadership on this issue by Mr. Civil Rights in the United States Senate, a name that some of you may remember, Hubert Humphrey. They had to decide what to do. Paul Douglas got up on the floor of the House of the Senate of the United States and gave a speech along the following lines. He said, "I want to say to my Negro friends that you'll be better off if the Integration Amendment is defeated and you get the housing that you need than you will be if the Integration Amendment is passed and you get no housing at all." Well, I'm not so sure we've been better off by the persuasiveness of Douglas's argument, although I don't minimize the fact that there was an enormous housing crisis that we had to solve, and that's similar to the housing crisis that we have today. Well, he persuaded his colleagues to vote against the Integration Amendment. It was defeated. The federal government then used that defeat as its justification for continuing to segregate all housing programs, not just public housing, for the next 15 years. The 1949 Housing Act was passed as a continued segregated program. Under the 1949 Housing Act, the vast expansion of public housing that created a lot of the public housing that we're familiar with took place. The giant towers in big cities across the country were built under the 1949 Act as a segregated program. Perhaps the most famous of the projects was Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis. Some of you may remember that name. It was actually two projects. Pruitt was for African Americans. Igoe was for whites. It's clearly defined projects. It's not that whites happened to apply to the Igoe project because they like to live with each other of the same race, and blacks happen to like to apply to the Pruitt project because they like to live with each other of the same race. These were clearly designated projects of blatant constitutional violation on the part of the federal government and local housing authorities. But they were built. Very soon thereafter, a development occurred that was quite surprising. The white projects everywhere in the country developed large numbers of vacancies. The black projects developed long waiting lists. And even the most bigoted public housing officials couldn't sustain and defend a situation where some of their projects were virtually empty and others had long waiting lists. Eventually, they had to open up all projects to African Americans, and the projects became mostly an African American institution. But then something else also happened at about this time. The industry that was supporting that African American urban population moved to the suburbs. It moved to the suburbs because it no longer needed to be located near deep water ports or near railroad terminals. The highways were being built. Industry could move out to rural areas and to suburban areas and have single continuous assembly lines instead of multi-story plants. The jobs in the urban areas disappeared. The African Americans who were living in this public housing became poorer and poorer, less able to pay rent, the full cost of the rent. The government started to subsidize the projects. Once the government started to subsidize the projects, it stopped investing in them, stopped maintaining them. Maintenance workers who got good incomes, good jobs, were evicted from the public housing projects because it was now only for poor people. It was a subsidized program. They couldn't live in the projects where they worked. The projects gradually became the kind of deteriorated urban slums that we associate with public housing. But that's not how public housing began in this country, and it's not how it actually needs to be. But be that as it may, the question that should be arising in your mind, unless you've read my book, in which you know the answer already, but why did all these vacancies occur in the white projects and not in the black ones? And the reason for that was another federal program that was even more powerful in segregating the country than the public housing program. And that was a program of the Federal Housing Administration, another New Deal agency, that was explicitly designed on a racial basis to suburbanize the entire, white population into single-family homes in all white suburbs. This was an explicit racial program. The first one actually was built here in Houston, Oak Forest, a segregated all-white project built by the Federal Housing Administration for whites only, getting whites out of urban areas into suburban communities. The most famous of them is Levittown. You've all heard of that, east of New York City, I assume. Or if you haven't, maybe you remember hearing Pete Seeger sing a song about little boxes on a hillside made of ticky-tacky, and they all look the same. That was a project that was just as large as Levittown, south of San Francisco, called Westlake. Los Angeles became the symbol of suburbanization in this country. Places like Panorama City, for example, were FHA all-white projects created on an explicitly racial basis. These developers, someone like Levitt, William Levitt, who built Levittown. Levittown was 17,000 homes. And remember, we're talking about a time, late 1940s, when suburbs weren't the commonplace location of middle-class and working-class families. People didn't know that anybody would want to move to the suburbs at that time. A proposal to build 17,000 homes in one place seemed ridiculous. No bank would be crazy enough to lend Levitt the money to buy the land and build a development of that size, or the same thing is true of any of the others that I just mentioned. The only way Levitt could build that project was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting his plans for the development, and asking for a federal bank loan guarantee that would permit him to proceed. And the Federal Housing Administration gave him that guarantee, provided he agreed never to sell a home to an African American, and provided that he agreed to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans and rental to African Americans. And this was done in every one of those suburbs, and in hundreds and hundreds of them in between the two coasts. Every metropolitan area in the country was suburbanized in this way. This policy was not the policy of rogue bureaucrats working in the Federal Housing Administration. It was official written government policy. The federal government issued a manual that was distributed to appraisers whose job it was to investigate the applications of builders and developers for these suburban developments and to recommend whether the FHA should guarantee their bank loans. And the manual said explicitly you could not recommend a development for a federal bank guarantee if it was going to be integrated. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't even recommend a development that was all white for federal guarantees if it was located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, and I'm quoting, it would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. Where did this notion of de facto segregation come from? It has no basis in fact whatsoever. These policies, and there were many others of them, but taking just these two, the Federal Housing Administration policy to create a white noose around every urban area in the country, and the public housing program on a segregated basis, which concentrated African Americans in urban areas. These two policies are primarily responsible for the segregation we know today. It's not that there wasn't private bigotry. Of course there was. It's enormous private bigotry. But the federal Constitution that we all believe in and support requires government to resist, to fail to accede to private bigotry. Private bigotry is no excuse for the violations of civil rights that the federal government commits. And as such, as I said, we're required to remedy it. Well, there were many, many other policies that federal, state, and local governments followed. There's a very, southern states, some southern cities, like here in Houston, a very creative one was developed actually before the New Deal. Houston had an area, and you're much more familiar with it than I am, but the Houston planners decided that they wanted to concentrate its African American population on the south side, I believe it was, and remove African Americans from the west side. And so what the school board did in Houston was it built a new school for African Americans on the south side of Houston. Remember, we had school segregation then in Houston. Built a new school for African Americans on the south side of Houston, a high school, very modern, well-equipped high school, and started to not maintain schools for African Americans elsewhere in the city. So if any African American families wanted their children to be educated, they had to relocate to the south side. By the same token, they built a new high school for whites on the west side and failed to maintain schools for whites that were located outside where the city plan wanted whites to live. And by that means, the patterns of segregation were created in Houston even before the New Deal. I'll give you an example of a trivial program to show you how extensive these policies were from top to bottom. In the course of doing my research for the book, I had to read I came upon read an African-American newspaper in Los Angeles called The Eagle, the California Eagle. And I was reading through the newspaper and I came across this article about Culver City, which a suburb of Los Angeles is now known for making movies. At that time, it was an all-white suburb. In those days, this was during World War II, and in those days, there were air raid wardens on the east and west coast whose job it was to go door to door every evening to make sure that people had turned down their lights, put up blackout curtains, and so forth. My father was one on the East Coast. The city attorney of Culver City convened a meeting of all the air raid wardens in Culver City. And he distributed to the air raid wardens blank form restrictive covenants and told the air raid wardens restrictive covenants is one of these agreements that the FHA was requiring that get attached to a deed that prohibit resale to African Americans. And he told the air raid wardens that we went door to door, make sure that every family was up to date in having signed a commitment never to sell a home to an African American. That was the most local possible violation of civil rights, but as much a 14th Amendment violation as any of the other policies I've described. Well, the solutions to this, the remedies to this, are easy to develop. There's no difficulty in figuring out what we would do to remedy the civil rights violations that created our segregated nation. In my book, I describe a few of them, but as I mentioned before, I'm not a housing expert. I know a lot about education policy, but they're easy. For example, we face the same Douglas dilemma that I described earlier. We face the same opportunity to make the devil's bargain that Douglas made. More houses, solving the housing crisis or fighting segregation. And what we do is make the same choice that Douglas made simply because we're sensitive to the housing crisis. And that is what affordable housing we build, we place primarily in already low-income segregated neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. Because it's easier to do. And we want to address the housing crisis. As I said, I'm sympathetic to Douglas's dilemma. I think he made the wrong choice, and I think we're making the wrong choice today. But I understand developers would rather place low-income housing in already low-income neighborhoods. The land is cheaper there frequently. They don't have to hold 100 community meetings trying to explain to people why they're bringing black and brown people into your neighborhood. If they put it in a low-income neighborhood, they can put a sign in the window, a for rent sign, when there's an apartment available and people walking by can see it. Why not build there rather than having to put up with all the trouble and difficulty and expense of building in a high opportunity community? And so that's what we do. We solve the Douglas dilemma also with our housing choice vouchers, what we commonly call Section 8. Most of those are used to place low-income families in already low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing segregation. Both of those programs are easy to modify. The Federal Treasury Department actually has a priority in its regulations for the low-income housing tax credit, a priority in placing these developments in low-income neighborhoods. On the theory, I think it's a crazy theory, that if we put more low-income housing into low-income neighborhoods, it's going to revitalize those neighborhoods. But that's the theory of federal policy. It's not hard to amend that policy, to revise it. It's not hard to develop new regulations for Section 8 that don't require that all Section 8 vouchers, or almost all Section 8 vouchers, get used to reinforce segregation. We can do things at the high end. I'll give you an extreme example, much more difficult than the two policies I just mentioned, politically difficult. I mentioned before that I guess I should say this. I described all those suburbs that we created in the mid-20th century. Levittown, Oak Forest, is that what it's called? Here in Houston. Panorama City. Those homes were modest homes that the Federal Housing Administration was creating, subsidizing. I say subsidizing because white families could move out of public housing into these federally subsidized single-family homes and pay less in their monthly housing costs than they were paying for rent in public housing. But they were inexpensive. They cost $7,000, $8,000, $9,000. Very modest homes. In today's money, that's about $100,000. Today, those homes, same homes, sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. They've appreciated. The white families who moved into those homes gained over the next few generations $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 in wealth. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to weather emergencies, perhaps temporary unemployment or medical emergencies. They used it to subsidize their retirements. And they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren who then had down payments for their own homes. The result is that today, African American incomes on average are about 60% of white incomes, 60%. I told you I'm going to exempt you from having to hear another lecture tonight on that disparity, that 60%. Let's just take that disparity as a given, a 60% disparity in income. You would think that if there was a 60% income disparity, there would be a 60% wealth disparity as well. But in reality, while African American incomes on average are about 60% of white incomes, African American wealth is about 10% of white wealth. And that entire disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century. We could remedy that. It's not hard to figure out how to remedy it. The federal government could, for example, begin buying up homes in places like Levittown and Panorama City and the Little Boxes community for market rates, $400,000, $500,000, whatever they might be, and resell them to qualified African Americans for $100,000. That would be a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. And I can assure you, I've given this lecture to American Bar Association groups and other lawyer groups. Nobody has ever challenged that. That would be a perfectly defensible, narrowly targeted remedy for a specific constitutional violation. We should challenge zoning laws that prohibit the construction in high opportunity communities of anything but single family homes and large lot sizes. Prohibit the construction of townhouses or mixed income housing. Or even public housing that would be mixed income, as it should be. Those zoning ordinances, in my view, are unconstitutional because they're perpetuating an unconstitutionally created situation and should be challenged on that basis. So the policies to remedy this are not hard to understand. What is hard is to develop the political will to do it, to develop the new civil rights movement that's going to not just employ lawyers and policy experts, but marches and demonstrations and whatever you guys do with your iPhones. Tactics that a new civil rights movement will have to employ in order to demand these policy changes if we're going to be true to our responsibilities as American citizens. Because the segregation that we have created, and I mean we, our government, speaking for all of us, the segregation we have created is responsible for the most serious social problems we face in this country. I mentioned just a minute ago the wealth gap, which is the biggest cause of inequality between the races in this country. I mentioned at the beginning of my talk the achievement gap in schools, which is a reflection of school segregation. There is health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans have shorter life expectancies, more heart disease, primarily because they live in more stressful, more polluted, less healthy neighborhoods. It's responsible for the tragedies of violence between police and young African American men in this country, whether it was Ferguson or Baltimore or Milwaukee. We could not have those situations if we weren't concentrating the most disadvantaged young men without access to jobs in the formal economy or even transportation to those jobs in single neighborhoods. Couldn't otherwise happen. And I'd suggest finally that the racial segregation that we've created is coming back now to bite us in the form of a political polarization that is not solely racial, but that certainly tracks racial lines. How can we ever expect to create the common national identity that's essential for the preservation of this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that they have no ability to understand each other's life experiences, to develop, the common national identity that we require. So the racial segregation that we've required is, that we've created underlies our most serious problems in this country. It can only be resolved, the policies are easy to develop, it can only be resolved with a new civil rights movement that I hope and expect all of you will join and lead to undo this problem that we've created. So thank you very much for your attention, and
Thank you very much for such a stimulating talk. We are going to take questions from the audience via the note cards. I see Sarah up there and Chris are ready to take your note cards. So just hold your card up, and they'll come around and get them, and then I'll ask some questions. But I want to begin by asking, I guess the first question that came to my mind was, so have you heard from the Chief Justice since this book was written? But I think the larger question is, do you see any movement in legal thinking about this de facto versus de jure segregation as a result of the book and your talks?
I don't care what the Chief Justice thinks. I want to emphasize that this is and I don't mean to be critical, Bill, but this is a trap we've fallen into. The Chief Justice's mind will change when a civil rights movement demands that it changes. The same way that it changed in previous eras. It didn't change because they read good books. It changed because the political necessities required them to change. And so my intended audience is not the Supreme Court. My intended audience is the people in this room, and I'm so grateful to you for listening to me.
Did you find, you gave us some really great examples from different cities, and you seem to suggest that because it seemed to me like you were suggesting that because it was federal policy that was driven, these changes, these segregation patterns and these civil rights violations occurred nationally. You gave us some local examples too. Were there instances where, in fact, there was a different set of local policies or something like that somehow counteracted the federal policy, or was that just the federal policy was just too overwhelming?
Well, it was federal, state, and local policy, as you acknowledge. As I mentioned, I couldn't go into all of the policies I described, that I can describe in the book, and the book didn't even describe all the policies that can be mentioned. But there was, of course, we're a big country, and there was variation. There was different degrees of this policy being implemented. There were a couple of counterexamples that I can give. I lied to you before when I said that every single federal housing project during World War II was segregated. I found one that wasn't. It was in Marin County, California, where there was another shipyard, and during the war, and the shipyard ramped up so quickly as the war came near that the administrators of the shipyard could only accept workers, not families, and so they built dormitories, and the workers came so quickly that all they could do was hand out pillows and blankets when they arrived and not segregated. So they had integrated dormitories, and that worked out so well that when the families arrived and they built family housing, they integrated that as well. Yeah, there were counterexamples like that. Let me just say, if I may, the leading opponent of these, or the most prominent opponent of all these policies, was the president's own wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was quite outspoken about how these policies were wrong, and there were some administration officials who were opposed to them as well, so there was debate about it. Certainly African Americans were aware of it and protested it, so it's not as though nobody knew any better. And that's a key point, because I think it's one thing to excuse people by saying that nobody knew any better, but that's not the case. There was a debate about this in the country.
You mentioned a possible remedy would be for the federal government to buy homes in white neighborhoods at market prices, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, and resell them at a lower price to qualified African American families. One of the members of the audience says, what about purchasing homes of blacks in segregated areas at the market value equal to white neighborhoods?
Well, as I said, I'm not a housing expert, and I'd have to think about that policy and what its practical implementation challenges would be, and deciding what the price would be. So I don't know, but that's the kind of national discussion we have to have. Is exactly what these policies would be. Elizabeth Warren, who doesn't have majority support for this, did introduce a bill to subsidize the purchase of housing. I don't think she specifically the way I described it, but something similar to what I described, for which families who have lived in traditionally red line neighborhoods would be eligible. So that would be an example of.
What's your view of that? Do you have an opinion about that? Because that's one of the other questions.
Well, yeah, I don't think there's majority support for it. As I said, I want to see a civil rights movement that's going to demand a discussion about, a debate about this bill that she's put forward. We don't have that yet. But, she says that the people who've lived in traditionally red line neighborhoods, it has to be for a period of time. It's not the gentrifiers who would be eligible for this. They have to be living there for some time. But, she has to put it that way. She has to put it that way because the current Supreme Court will not permit a racially specific explicit policy. So this is race neutral. If you happen to live in a red line neighborhood, you're eligible for the program, even if you're white. But I think it's a good start, but I hope that she's doing it as a way of starting a national conversation and not just as a campaign prop.
Thank you. There's a lot of discussion in Houston, as there is in all large cities today, about gentrification. That is to say, the renewed prosperity of some neighborhoods in which the prosperity might squeeze out the residents who live there already. There is considerable discussion and concern here in Houston, as there is elsewhere, about the idea that the new federal opportunity zone program might actually accelerate that gentrification in a way that is detrimental to the historic residents. In fact, I was on a panel yesterday in Austin where somebody called that gentrification on steroids. Do you have can you comment on the current gentrification question, and if you have an opinion about the opportunity zones?
I guess I don't, I'm going to take that in two parts because I don't really understand the connection between the two. But gentrification, it's the most serious problem that comes up when I give these talks. And, gentrification does have the potential to create integrated communities, both income integrated and racially integrated communities, if it were controlled. What's happening nationwide with gentrification is it's not controlled. And communities are being gentrified, simply displace the existing residents, who then wind up in a new segregated low-income community, typically is even more disadvantaged because it's farther away from jobs and transportation and amenities than it was before. So how do we control gentrification so that it has a positive outcome rather than negative? We can't stop it. You can't prevent people from buying property. So you can't stop it entirely, but you can regulate it. One way to regulate it is freezing the property taxes, having a policy that freezes property taxes of existing homeowners so that people pay property taxes as long as they hold their home at the rate of the value of the home when they first purchased it. Now, California's had a program like that for 30, 40 years called Prop 13. It's been a disaster. It's been a disaster not because people can stay in their homes. They can. It has that good effect. But it's been a disaster because it robbed school districts and other public programs of the resources that they need. And as a result of Prop 13, California schools went from being among the best in the country to among the worst in the country. But there's a very easy fix you could do to that program. We could freeze property taxes so that people living in gentrifying neighborhoods could remain in their homes and not be forced out because they can no longer pay the property taxes on their homes as the values of their homes rise. We could freeze the property taxes, but we could recoup the lost property taxes at point of sale. So if you have a homeowner in a historically black neighborhood who bought a home 30 years ago for $50,000 and it's now worth $500,000, they pay property taxes at the $50,000 rate as long as they live there. But when they sell it for $500,000, the property taxes that had been foregone in that period get deducted from the profits, and returned to the schools and the public treasuries, and the result is that the homeowner, instead of making a $450,000 profit, only makes a $350,000 profit. It still contributes not only to that homeowner's new wealth, which is important, it also enables them to remain in the home as long as they want. So that's one policy. We could, and I know that Texas preempts a lot of this, but we could have inclusionary zoning that requires any development, not just in a gentrifying neighborhood, but anywhere, to have a share of units for low and moderate income families, as well as market rate families. We could prohibit, or have a limit, not prohibit, we could have a limit on condominium conversions. We could, well, so there are many, and like I say, the policies are well known. The problem, but there's one other thing I want to say about that. Even if we did all of those things, and we prevented gentrification from displacing all of the previous residents of the community, and created an integrated by income as well as by race community in these gentrifying neighborhoods, still a lot of people would be displaced. You can't do both. You can't preserve everybody's right to remain and still have permit people to buy property. So what happens to the people who are displaced? They presently go, as I said, to less adequate neighborhoods, new segregated places that are even more disadvantageous than the ones where they were living. And so in order to preserve and prevent the worst outcomes of gentrification, we not only need those policies I just described in the gentrifying neighborhoods, but we need to make sure that people who are displaced have high opportunity places to go to. And that requires the other policies that I was describing before, like the reform of the low-income housing tax credit in Section 8 and so forth. So the second part of the question was...
You've done
okay.
In fact, as you've done several times, you answered the next question. There are so many great questions. I'm going to ask about 3 or 4 more, and then we'll move on to the book signing. I'm wondering, you sort of answered this, but you addressed this issue. But I'm wondering, what is your view about how tying school funding to property taxes and property values, how does that affect or further exacerbate the segregation of residential communities, as opposed to some other form of?
Well, it's certainly a problem. I think it's more complicated, though, than we commonly think. As I said before, my fundamental conviction about school policy is that the major cause of the problems we have in schools is segregation. And no matter how much more money we pour into low-income schools, they're not going to overcome that problem. And in fact, we have a lot of misunderstanding about school finance. We typically think that schools serving low-income black children get less per pupil funding than schools serving middle-class children. That's not actually the case. Those data, which are so widely circulated, are only based on state and local funding. They don't take account of the pretty substantial federal funds that go disproportionately into low-income minority schools. And on average, low-income minority schools, once you include federal funds, get more per pupil spending than typical white schools. Not more than the affluent white schools, but more than the typical middle-class white school. The problem is it's not enough. It's never going to be enough. So giving low-income schools marginally better funding, which we now do with federal Title I programs, is not enough to solve the problems that I talked about earlier of concentrating children with asthma or lead poisoning or et cetera, in a single school. So I'm all in favor of reforming our, because certainly better funded schools will do a better job than worse funded schools. So I'm not opposed to school funding reform, but I think it's a mistake to think that the primary problem that we face in education today is disparities in school funding. It's the concentration of disadvantage in segregated communities. It's the primary problem we face.
Okay, a couple more questions. You spoke largely about African Americans. You did not address the question of whether this racism extended to Hispanics. Now that Hispanics are in most places, including Houston, the plurality of the new population, and now that especially in places like Houston, the population is so much more diverse. Were there or are there other aspects of racism involving other ethnic or racial groups that we should be paying attention to?
I don't know, Bill. You know, I give a simple-minded lecture and you come up with all these very complicated questions. Let me answer that in a couple ways. First of all, of course there was state-sponsored discrimination in places like Texas and California and Colorado. But the New Deal wasn't focused primarily on places like this. There were very few Hispanic families in the eastern cities that the New Deal was from, eastern and Midwestern cities, where most of the population of the country was at this time and where the federal policy and federal officials came from. So that's one answer. The policies were explicitly directed to African Americans. Second answer is that the discrimination that other groups faced was of different quality, as in quantity, magnitude as well as quality. And here's an example from this state. I mentioned the Public Works Administration policies that built the first public housing, but in 1937, the public housing program was changed, and the 1937 Housing Act required localities to have their own housing agencies. So it became a joint federal-local program. The very first public housing to be built under the 1937 Housing Act was in Austin, Texas, because the leading proponent in Congress of public housing was the congressman from Austin, who was Lyndon Johnson. Right. So that was the first public housing built under the 1937 Housing Act. They built three projects in Austin. One for African Americans, one for whites, one for Hispanics. Three separate projects racially designated. There was a difference though. The black project, which was placed on the east side of Austin, was also in the area that the Austin City Plan had designated as a black ghetto. So Austin then began the kinds of policies that I described before took place in Austin to shift the entire black population into this area where it had placed the public housing project. The same thing was not done with Hispanics. Although there was a separate Hispanic public housing project, Mexican origin residents of Austin were not pressured or required. The schools weren't closed outside. They were permitted to live throughout the Austin area. It was just so it happened to be a segregated project. So it was a difference in degree. In California, there were restrictive covenants, these deeds that prohibited resale, and it included Mexican origin as well as African American families in its prohibitions. The courts refused to enforce them against Hispanic families because they said that Hispanics were really Caucasians and you couldn't enforce a restrictive covenant against them. So I'm not minimizing in any way the discrimination that Hispanics and Asians in particular faced in some of the Western states, but it's not the same as the policies we followed towards a group that were descendants of American slaves, because we've never really dealt with the legacies of slavery in this country. Let me add one other thing to this, too lengthy answer, if I may, and that is that immigrant groups, low-wage immigrant groups, have always settled in homogeneous neighborhoods where their language is spoken, where They have informal job networks. And the same is true of recent Hispanic immigrants. If we look at third generation and beyond Hispanics in this country, they are not segregated to the extent that African Americans are. And one of the most stunning statistics that I've read, and there's a sociology professor who probably knows more about this than I do, but 40% of third generation and beyond Hispanics marry non-Hispanics. So there's nothing similar like that going on in the African American population.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Let's thank you, Mr. Rothstein. Thank you all for coming tonight. We will be having several upcoming events later this spring. On February 27th, Jeff Speck, who's a city planner, who's just written a new book about walkability and walking, is going to give an Urban Reads event about his new book, and also about how walking in Houston will be affected by the I-45 project. That will be at the Match in Midtown. On April 22nd, former Mayor Mick Cornett of Oklahoma City is going to talk about his book, The Next American City, also at the Match. And then on May 22nd, here at the MFA, our final Kinder Institute Forum of the year will be with Maurice Cox, the current Director of Planning and Development for the City of Detroit, and he'll be talking about strategies for equitable development, very much a follow-up of Mr. Rothstein's talk. As I said, there will be a book signing outside, but we ask that you let Mr. Rothstein get outside first. Just clear a path, let him get out, let the waters part, and then he'll be there to talk to you and sign your books. Thank you very much.